welcome to our Yeats 150 event. To begin proceedings this evening, I would like to introduce our new Vice Chancellor, Professor Janet Beer, who joined us at the University of Liverpool in February. Professor Beer is a literary scholar, and we are delighted she could be with us. It is especially apt that she is here to commemorate one of Ireland's greatest writers, W.B. Yeats.
Good evening. It gives me enormous pleasure on behalf of the University of Liverpool to welcome you all here this evening. It's a very special panel discussion to mark the 150th anniversary of the birth of one of Ireland's greatest poets, William Butler Yeats. It's a fantastic tribute to the work of the Institute of Irish Studies and indeed to Irish culture in general. So many of you have come out this evening to join in the celebration of this wonderful poet and his work. I know that his legacy has inspired Irish people, but also people throughout the world. The University of Liverpool is very proud of the important outreach role that the Institute plays in our local, national and indeed worldwide community. And on this occasion I would like to thank you all for your continued support of the Institute's work. Finally, I would like to extend a very warm welcome and thanks to our prestigious panel, His Excellency Dan Mulhall, Fergal, Keane, Tom French and Martin Dyar, who have come here this evening to share their experience of Yeats with us all. I hope you enjoy the discussion. I'm now going to hand you back to Dr. Frank Shovlin, the expert. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to tell you a little bit more about our panel and the format of the event before we begin in earnest. Ambassador Mulhall has been a great friend to us here at the Institute, and he's known to many of you now. A Waterford man by birth, he has had diplomatic postings in New Delhi, Vienna, Brussels and Edinburgh. Between 2001 and 2005, he was Ireland's ambassador to Malaysia, Thailand, Laos and Vietnam. Prior to his appointment in London, he was ambassador in Berlin. Among his interests are Irish history and literature, on which he has published many articles and a book, A New Day Dawning, a portrait of Ireland in 1900. Most importantly, perhaps, he is a long-standing and passionate Yeats enthusiast. Tom French was born in Kilkenny and raised across the border in Tipperary. He now lives in County Meath, where he earns his living as a librarian. Tom's first collection, Touching the Bones, was awarded the Forward Prize for first collection in 2002. His second collection, The Fire Step, was published in October 2009. And his latest collection, Midnight Star, was published last year, all by Gallery Press. Fergal Keane is an award-winning BBC Special Correspondent and a Professorial Fellow here at the Institute of Irish Studies. He was born in London and brought up in Ireland. Fergal comes from a well-known literary and theatrical family and is a nephew of the playwright John B. Keane. He has published 7 books. His most recent is Road of Bones, an account of the Japanese invasion of India during World War II. Fergal is currently working on a history of the beginnings of British imperialism. And finally, Martin Dyar grew up in Swinford, County Mayo. His debut poetry collection, Maiden Names, published in 2013, was selected as a Book of the Year in the Guardian and the Irish Times, and was shortlisted for the Pigott Poetry Prize and the Shine Strong Award. Martin won the Patrick Kavanagh Award in 2009 for Best Unpublished Collection, and the Strokestown International Poetry Award in 2001. He has also written a play, Tom Loves the Lord, about the Irish poet Thomas Moore. More recently, he was a writer in residence at the prestigious International Writing Programme at the University of Iowa. So tonight, of course, it isn't about our speakers so much, or the Institute, as about W.B. Yeats, Ireland's greatest poet. Yeats was born on the 13th of June, 1865, and so we find ourselves tonight just shy of the 150th anniversary of his birth. I hope you will all find this evening's event a pleasant antidote to the long and often tedious election campaign through this It'll be very interesting to see who gets in on today. One of the attractions of W.B. Yeats, as with any great writer, is that it provides answers to many of our most profound questions about the world and our lives in it. One of the very last poems he wrote, age 73, was titled Politics. It was written the year before the outbreak of the Second World War, as Europe divided itself up into ever-hardening ideological camps. It goes like this. How can I, that girl standing there, my attention fix on Roman or on Russian or on Spanish politics? Yet here's a travelled man that knows what he talks about, and there's a politician that has both read and thought, and maybe what they say is true of war and war's alarms. But oh, that I were young again and held her in my arms. That raising of the personal moment of beauty and value above any larger, more complex political subject is typical of Yeats. Although, as our readers will demonstrate over the next hour or so, Yeats's range was vast and his ambitions as a writer unbounded. In reading W.B. Yeats, thinking about him, treasuring his mesmerizing images and turns of phrase, I'm reminded of what the great French writer Marcel Proust said of his artistic hero, the essayist and art critic John Ruskin. For the man of genius cannot give birth to immortal works, except by creating them in the image, not of his mortal being, but of the humanity he bears within himself. His thoughts are, in a way, lent to him for his lifetime, of which they are the companions. At his death, they will turn to humanity to teach it. Dead, he continues to enlighten us, like those dead stars whose light reaches us still. So let's begin tonight's proceedings then with a twinkling from that dead star.
I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. And I shall have some peace there, for peace comes dropping slow, dropping from the vales of the morning to where the cricket sings. There midnight's all a glimmer, and noon a purple glow, and evening full of the linnet's wings. I will arise and go now, for always, night and day, I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore, while I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's grey. I hear it in the deep heart's core.
We'll now have Dan Mulhall, who has to follow W.B. Yeats.
Thank you very much to W.B. Yeats for introducing me in such a way. In fact, that poem is one of the reasons why I'm here, because as a young diplomat, I have my copy of Yeats' collected poems here, and I see from the inside cover that it was purchased in January 1976, which means that I bought it, I'm sure, with a book token I was given by my parents for Christmas in 75. So you can see that my interest in Yeats goes back a long way. And in those days I had relatively few books, but I packed them all up into my diplomatic bag and shipped them off to India, where I had my first posting. And I'm not sure I ever really expected that Yeats would play a major part of my life. I bought this book when I was doing my master's thesis, and I had come under the spell of Yeats' work in the summer of 1975 when I was preparing for my BA honours in those days in University College Cork. The exams for honours BA, honours English took place in September, so we had a whole summer. And I remember reading Yeats' poems. In those days it was a paperback edition of his selected poetry that I had. And such was my enthusiasm for his work that I ended up doing my MA thesis partly on W.B. Yeats. When I started working in the Department of Foreign Affairs in 1978, I probably thought that Yeats would be put away and this book would go on to one of my bookshelves and would rarely be seen again during my career. But I had a real awakening, because one day in 1982, I was invited by a distinguished Indian lady. Her name was Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit. You probably haven't heard of her, but I was a friend of her granddaughter's, and I was invited round to the grandmother's house. You probably have heard of her brother, Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Indian Prime Minister. And Mrs. Pandit held court in her home in New Delhi, a large Indian bungalow. And when she discovered I was Irish, she immediately burst into a recitation by heart of the late Gallagher Free and When You're Old and Grey and Full of Sleep and Nodding by the Fire. And that was a moment when my eyes opened and I realized that Yeats was not just somebody that an Irish student could read and enjoy and be interested in for a university degree or a thesis that I was writing back in the mid-70s, but he was actually a global phenomenon. And throughout my time in India, I came across people who were passionate enthusiasts for Yeats' work. Indeed, I bought a book from an Indian lady whose father had met Yeats in 1921 while he was studying at Oxford. And that book I still have. It's one of my proudest possessions. It's signed by W.B. Yeats with a couplet of Yeats' verse. For wisdom is a butterfly and not a stormy bird of prey. It's from a poem called Tom Roughly. So, I have for the last 35 years of my diplomatic career found Yeats to be an excellent means for interpreting Ireland. And I remember when I was in Kuala Lumpur, I attended a summit meeting of the non-aligned movement. I was sitting there with other diplomats, watching the speeches being made, and I remember the then South African president, Nelson Mandela's successor, Thabo Mbeki, gave a speech. He was the keynote speaker at that non-aligned summit meeting in Kuala Lumpur in 2003 or thereabouts. His speech was essentially a meditation on the Second Coming. Turning and turning on a widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Wonderful. He basically used every line of Yeats' great poem in order to reflect on the dilemmas, the international issues of that particular time, more than 10 years ago. So Yeats' work has this quality that there are so many aspects to it. What I really like about Yeats is that I enjoy the early poems, which you can recite, which stick in the memory. But I also enjoy the more complex, later poems. And I think that one of Yeats' great assets is that he is a wonderful interpreter of the Ireland of his time. And I always like to summarize Yeats' appeal with 3 W's, not World Wide Web, but words, witness, and wisdom. The words you've heard, the great way he has of combining words to give them maximum effect. The witness, he is a witness to his times. He was not some dreamy poet of the ivory tower writing his verses in splendid isolation on romantic themes. He was a romantic poet in his early years, but he was also a man who was fully engaged in public life, in the life of Ireland from the 1890s to the 1930s. He was constantly involved. He was, as he said, among school children, a 60-year-old smiling public man. But he was also a 30-year-old smiling public man, a 40-year-old and a 50-year-old, because throughout his life he had this intensive engagement with Ireland. It was never an easy enchantment. He was constantly arguing with Ireland. He was having a lifelong dialogue with his country. but it's fascinating to see how this dialogue developed throughout his life. And even in his final poem, Under Ben Bulben, he comes back to the idea that ancient Ireland knew it all. So throughout his life, he had this tempestuous argument with the Ireland of his time. He didn't like a lot of the things that he saw. At one stage, he declared romantic Ireland is dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave. He thought that Ireland was over for him because the dreams of his youth had been foiled. Ireland had failed him. Within a couple of years of that poem being written, he was inspired by the Easter Rising of 1916. And I want to read Easter 1916. And I read it because I really believe it is probably the greatest Irish poem of the 20th century. Because it deals with the seminal event of 20th century Irish history. And it deals with it in a complex and fascinating way. And I'm going to use this poem next year extensively when it comes to explaining the Easter Rising to people here in Britain. Because if you want to give somebody a quick tutorial on the Easter Rising, copy that poem and give it to them, because most of what you want to know about the Easter Rising is in there. I'm not saying that it's completely, it obviously contains Yeats' own view, his own particular take on the Easter Rising, but it is a fascinating poem which really can give a genuine insight. The first verse, he dismisses the leaders of the Rising as people who were involved in a casual comedy. They were, they lived where motley is war. They were not serious people. He didn't think anything would come of their revolutionary activities. The second verse, he pays tribute to four of the leaders of the Easter Rising. Constance Markiewicz, Patrick Pearse, Thomas MacDonagh, and Major John McBride, who was the one who hurt him by taking Maud Gonne away from him and marrying Maud Gonne, much to Yeats' displeasure and disapproval. And then, in the third and fourth verses, you get this extended meditation as he tries to understand the nature of this great historical event and its implications. And these days, it's impossible to think about the Easter Rising without Yeats' lines, all's changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. That's a marvellous way of approaching the Easter Rising, because he's not a cheerleader for the Rising. He's ambivalent about it, but he was inspired by the sacrifice that he saw being made by these people, whom he dismissed as jokers early on, but then had come to realize, and he once wrote, shortly after the Easter Rising, in a letter, he said that he never thought that any public event could move him so much. But he continued to be ambivalent about the Rising, and this poem is full of ambivalence, and that's why it's such a marvellous poem, because he's not a cheerleader for the Rising, but he's also not a polemicist against the Rising. He's someone who was moved by it, and it inspired him to write this great poem. Easter 1916. I have met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces from counter or desk among grey 18th century houses. I have passed with a nod of the head, or polite, meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite, meaningless words, and thought before I had done of a mocking tale or a jibe to please a companion around the fire at the club, being certain that they and I but lived where motley is worn. All changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. That woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument until her voice grew shrill. What voice more sweet than hers, when young and beautiful she rode to harriers? This man had kept a school and rode our winged horse. This other helper and friend, was coming into his force. He might have won fame in the end, so sensitive his nature seemed, so daring and sweet his thought. This other man, I had dreamed a drunken, vainglorious lout. He had done most bitter wrong to some who are near my heart. Yet I number him in my song. He too has resigned his part in the casual comedy. He too has been changed in his turn, transformed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Hearts with one purpose alone, through summer and winter seen, enchanted to a stone to trouble the living stream. The horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range from cloud to tumbling cloud. Minute by minute they change. A shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. A horse hoof slides on the brim, and a horse clashes within it. The long-legged moorhens dive, and hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute they live, the stones in the midst of all. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? That is heaven's part. Our part, to murmur name upon name as a mother names her child, when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. What is it but nightfall? No, no, not night, but death. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse, MacDonagh and MacBride, and Connolly and Pearce. Now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Thank you very much.
Our next reader will be Fergal Keane.
The ambassador spoke about Yeats as somebody interpreting Ireland, and that is of course true. But for me also, as somebody travelling the world, most of the time in conflict zones, he was somebody whose work I turned to again and again in my attempt to understand the world and the challenges that it presented, to understand life, to understand philosophy, to understand myself, to understand love. In the course of eulogising him, however, I think we need to recognise Yeats as a difficult customer. By anybody's standards. He had a whole range of views on political matters, some of which nowadays would be considered difficult in this modern Europe of integration. Even at the time were considered difficult. He could be a haughty, quite an austere man, and yet his great saving grace, I find, as a public individual, was his capacity for self-reflection. No true great poet can be great without the capacity to look inwards honestly and to speak openly on what he finds. There's that wonderful account he gives us of his meeting with James Joyce. And, I think we very few like to be brave enough to put this into print, but he says, having had this debate with Joyce about literature, I'm feeling that he bested Joyce. Yeats writes, I looked at my young man. I thought, I have conquered him now, but I was quite wrong. He merely said, generalizations aren't made by poets. They're made by men of letters. They're no use. Presently he got up to go, and as he was going out he said, I'm 20, how old are you? I told him, but I'm afraid I said I was a year younger than I am. He said with a sigh, I thought as much. I've met you too late. You're too old. The neck of Joyce, which was probably quite typical of him, the Joyce we've come to know, but also the magnanimity of Yeats to be able to tell the story. And I've often had this fantasy in my mind of the great imaginary Irish literary dinner party, if I could pick, and I sort of settled on 4 people because I think that's as much as you could manage without a civil war breaking. I allowed myself 4 guests, and so I picked, who would you want to you'd be sitting between. So I have Bean, Joyce, Beckett and Yeats. And now of course I realise that in each case there are attendant dangers. Bean would need to be watched because there would come a certain point in the night where you would worry about the damage to your clothes. Joyce, because once he's sung the Lass of Aughrim, he would settle into melancholia and then might become fractious to try and borrow money for a drink from me. Beckett, because there's only so much existential gloom you can take. And finally, Yeats. And my reservation about Yeats is that as soon as I opened my mouth, you would see my inner chancery. He had that great gift for seeing people and situations exactly as they were. I came first to the name of Yeats through my grandmother in Kerry and listening to her singing in her house on the Stole down by the Sally Gardens, which is a beautiful ballad, which I learned subsequently, of course, that Yeats, as they say in Irish traditional music, he got from listening to a song called You Rambling Boys of Pleasure, Give Ear Unto These Lines I Write, which he heard in County Sligo, where it had migrated from Antrim. And that was part of his great gift, of course, was the ability to listen to how people spoke. It wasn't just singing who was doing that, but listening to the language, the culture, the folk tales, the verse, ballads of the ordinary people. My parents were both actors and read Yeats aloud to us and steeped us, not in the politics first, but in the great mythology. My father was very romantic, so in the mythology of the love story of Yeats and Maud Gonne. Yeats and Irish politics didn't come later. It wasn't until secondary school, where there was no escaping W.B. Yeats if you went to and did the Leaving Cert in Ireland during the 1970s. And of course, Easter 1916, September 1913, they were key staples of our education, our introduction to Irish literature. As I said, it was Yeats and love that really did for me. And so often, if I'm talking about my own engagement with Yeats and how I stayed with Yeats for so many years, so often in my long lost love affairs as a teenager did I resort to quoting Yeats. When I think of it now, I blanch. Writing to girls, pity at the age of 15, and pity beyond all telling is hid in the heart of love. Or why should I blame her that she would have later taught to ignorant men most violent ways? That was quite some ending to a love affair. And then, of course, later in life, coming across a poem like When You Are Old. How many loved your moments of glad grace and loved your beauty with love false or true? But one man loved the pilgrim soul in you and loved the sorrows of your changing face. What I love most in Yeats is his mastery of craft, unsurpassed by anybody, but also tied to this immense capacity for emotion. So it's red-blooded and austere. I think you find it most perfectly expressed in a poem like The Fisherman, where he writes at the end how he wishes someday to write a poem for this man, this semi-mythical figure whom he comes across in Connemara, in that grey stone landscape. And he talks about wanting to write a poem as cold and passionate as the dawn. Now, if anybody can come up with a definition of great art more perfect than that, as cold and passionate as the dawn, I don't think anybody can. Of course, one of the things that makes him so popular is his endless quotability, in or out of context. Often myself, when I've been writing for the BBC's From Our Own Correspondent, from some conference on or other in the world, and I'm searching my memory of literature for the quote which would illuminate the situation or deepen the audience's understanding of the situation I'm in. It is often Yeats who comes to my rescue. What he writes of Ireland, I've found, can be so often applied to other places. Dan Mulhall, reading Easter 1916, that line, "Too long a sacrifice makes a stone of the heart." Many occasions in civil wars, from Bosnia to Rwanda, blood-dimmed tide, those lines have come back to me. I turn in conflict zones to poetry as the most intimate of consolations. And Yeats has given me, and continues to give me, a mix of inspiration, intellectual challenge, spiritual sustenance, and telephones. A good man's fault. No worries. As I was saying, De Valera said after he was arrested and then he came back to the stage after being out of the picture, as I was saying before, I was so rudely interrupted. But it wasn't rude. Anyway, sorry, it was this combination of consolation, of inspiration, and spiritual sustenance that I get from Yeats. And my choice to read tonight is one of his most challenging poems, but also I think one of the most personally honest and artistically daring of Yeats's work. It's called The Circus Animal's Desertion, and it deals, on the surface level at least, with the poet's search for inspiration when it seems that all of his poetic themes have been used up. It's a poem that is ruefully honest, it's self-critical in its assessment of his past writing and themes, but which has at the end a great defiance. The poet acknowledges what has left him, what has fled, and then, as Beckett said, I can't go on, I will go on. Circus Animal's Desertion. I sought a theme and sought for it in vain. I sought it daily for 6 weeks or so. Maybe at last, being but a broken man, I must be satisfied with my heart. Although winter and summer till old age began, my circus animals were all on show. Those stilted boys, that burnished chariot, lion and woman, and the Lord knows what. What can I but enumerate old themes? First, that sea rider Oisin led by the nose through 3 enchanted islands, allegorical dreams, vain gaiety, vain battle, vain repose. Themes of the embittered heart, or so it seems, that might adorn old songs or courtly shows. But what cared I that set him on to ride, I, starved for the bosom of his fairy bride? And then a counter-truth filled out its play. The Countess Kathleen was the name I gave it. She, pity-crazed, had given her soul away, but masterful heaven had intervened to save it. I thought my dear must her own soul destroy. So did fanaticism and hate enslave it. And this brought forth a dream, and soon enough this dream itself had all my thought and love. And when the fool and blind man stole the bread, Cuchulainn fought the ungovernable sea. Heart mysteries there, and yet, when all is said, it was the dream itself enchanted me. Character, isolated by a deed, to engross the present and dominate memory. Players and painted stage took all my love, and not those things that they were emblems of. Those masterful images, because complete, grew in pure mind, but out of what began? A mound of refuse or the sweepings of a street, old kettles, old bottles, and a broken can, old iron, old bones, old rags, that raving slut who keeps the till. Now that my ladder's gone, I must lie down where all the ladders start, in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart.
Our next speaker will be Tom French.
The title I gave my few remarks is Stolen. How would the horseman know to pass by, if not by mowing his nag to a standstill? I want to begin by reading Ivan Boland's beautiful Yeats in Civil War, and the first 3 lines that she used as an epigraph are from Yeats himself. Presently, a strange thing happened. I began to smell honey in places where honey could not be. In middle age, you exchanged the sandals of a pilgrim for a Norman keep in Galway. Civil war started. Vandals sacked your country, made off with your sleep. Somehow you arranged your escape aboard a spirit ship which every day hoisted sail out of fire and rape. And on that ship your mind was stowaway. The sun mounted on a wasted place, but the wind at every door and turn blew the smell of honey in your face, where there was none. Whatever we may learn, you are its sum, struggling to survive. A fantasy of honey, your reprieve. The second poem, I can't take any credit for writing it. It's a 2-line poem that came straight out of Mickey Gilligan's mouth. He was a Sligo man who showed William Butler Yeats everything he knew about fishing. I taught Willie Yeats everything he ever knew about fishing. And a damned poor fisherman he was, said Mickey Gilligan. By any reasonable definition of what constitutes a good fisherman, Mickey Gilligan's assessment of Yeats as a wielder of the rod is surely on the money. Yet, when we pursue the idea of the craft of angling versus the art of angling, we discover that while there may be fish to show for the trouble in the former, in the latter, all that is granted by the river is a receptiveness to connections, and a letting of one thing lead to another until some small completeness is realized. In the newly constituted vocational educational College na on the Meath coast, from where I've flown today, a group of 13-year-olds were recently exposed to the wishes for the cloths of heaven and opted on being offered the choice for the assignment to write of their own dreams in pure prose, rather than venture again to tread softly on Yeats's in verse by deigning to study a second of his poems. On an occasion such as this, when I cannot resist the word P-O-E-T being applied to me, I am reminded when I was little of the times when I was asked what I wanted to be when I was grown, and how it did not cost me a second thought, or strike me as strange to reply, a swan. In truth, to be a swan must have seemed as reasonable to the child I was as to be a poet seems as unreasonable now to the man I have become. 10 years ago, I wrote a poem set in the Municipal Gallery in Parnell Square, the first section of which, Sonata No. 5, Opus 24, Spring, in its entirety went. We entered the gallery in our winter coats, the first violin in a strapless ensemble. Her shoulders, I remember thinking, will be cold. Where the instrument touched her throat showed in the intermezzo between the scherzo and the adagio, when she hung her bow arm down to let the blood flow. At the time, I had more than a sneaking suspicion that the place itself occupied a special place in the pantheon of Irish poems, and had that sense confirmed when, in the first sentence of the introduction to the Penguin Anthology of Contemporary Irish Poetry, I read, Yeats is Everest. This evening, I should weep for my hubris in even daring to speak of Yeats. The Devil's Bit, the mountain that I grew up with in sight of in County Tipperary. The Devil's Bit does not address Everest, and yet I am reminded by his biographers that the living man had no time for reverence. As we face as a nation into a maelstrom of remembering, where the condition soon to be known as 1916 fatigue is yet on the cusp of diagnosis, I am reminded that the National Museum of Ireland has adapted the old Motorola factory just off the M50 motorway for deep storage for the Bronze Age remains, taken up during what have been dubbed by the poet Thomas McCarthy, the years of forgetting. Yeats is intimately bound up with that commemoration, and to consider his achievement is not just to expiate and cleanse our connection with him, to be reminded behind the masks and the visions that he is first and foremost a consummate maker of poems. It is to consider one's own life. The collarbone of a hair had to have been, if not on the tip of my tongue, at least in the air, when I brought a fine buck home in my front grille, after he crossed the broken line to duck into the gap between my lights, and I bore him across our road for the birds, supporting like a midwife the head, the neck, and the spirit of Robert Gregory can't have been 1,000 miles away when I tried to write about the only trace of the German pilot who was fished from the mouth of the Boyne just up the road from us during the last Great War, that survives in the county archive of Meath in a volume titled A Register of Interments of Bodies of Persons Washed Ashore, in which the sexton, a fisherman moonlighting among gravestones with shovel and pick, had the presence of mind to sketch a freehand map, a square, a line, an X within earshot of bird calls that fall on deaf ears, where you touched down to shake out like a vestment your parachute to air. It is only now that I realize the powerful influence the word airman exerted, bearing as it does a tremor of the lonely impulse of delight that drove to that tumult in the clouds. Apart from Patrick Kavanagh's, Irish poets, open your eyes, even Cabra can surprise. Try the dog track now and then, Shelburne Park and Crooked Men. The cheekiest response to Yeats's posthumous exhortation to sing whatever is well made, which, it is reported, caused furore among the generation writing in the 1930s, has to be Conor O'Callaghan's From Loose Change, in particular its second section titled The Heron, written in Yeatsian octava rima, which in its entirety goes: Dead master, old posturing taxidermist, forgive me when I can't help but hear my granddad and his like being dismissed. Or call it, if you prefer, a bookish night too far, contemplating sonnet after well-made sonnet, when I think stuff that ignorant men, they knew what they knew and acted on it, as opposed to some folks I could mention. Steering clear of reverence and finding a way in remain the abiding challenges. Seamus Heaney's The Master suggests, to get close I had to climb long and hard up deserted ramparts and not flinch, not raise an eye, to search for an eye on the watch from his coign of seclusion. Not flinching and not raising an eye, I breathe deeply and recall being miles away on my knees in a landlocked county in the Midlands, contemplating the mysteries, repeating the beautifully turned, turn then, most gracious advocate, thine eyes of mercy towards us, and after this our exile show unto us the blessed fruit, sipping between services the whole wine, and concerning myself with concealing the wine breath, and losing myself without knowing it was happening in St. Paul on love. And though I have the gift of prophecy, and understand all the mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have faith so that I could move mountains, if I have not love, I am nothing. Yeats occurs here first, between the desire for honours in the here and now, and all that talk of the life to come, of absence and unseen worlds. His printed lines, in danger of being obliterated, by scribbled interpretations in Augustine Martin's soundings, handed down like confirmation suits and communion dresses. Yeats is the gatekeeper to the adult life. Knowledge of what he means one disgorges in order to progress to the next stage of existence. As an antidote to wishing and heavenly cloth, I have to confess that I read Ted Hughes's February 17th to remind both my son and myself what it is we seek from poems that heavenly cloth cannot give. And shortly afterwards noticed his copy of No Country for Old Men on the hall table beside my copy of Slouching Towards Bethlehem. Frequently we need, as Derek Mahan's Hudson letter has it, 3,000 miles of water and 5 time zones to be reminded, when it comes to the old question of form in poetry, that form is to the poem as oxygen is to the body. And Yeats's great forms remind us that the body of the poem does not use the oxygen of form, but without oxygen it dies. And when Michael Longley speaks of the form of the poem being engaged in the business of energy conservation, the poem's whole charge being delivered repeatedly, if the thing is well made, he is singing out of Yeats's hymn book. In Yeats's own essay, The Symbolism of Poetry, written in 1900, he ventures to explain the purpose of rhythm as to prolong the moment of contemplation, the moment when we are both asleep and awake, which is the one moment of creation, by hushing us with an alluring monotony, while it holds us waking by variety, to keep us in that state of perhaps real trance, in which the mind, liberated from the pressure of the will, is unfolded in symbols. When Yeats speaks of real trance and the liberation of the mind from the pressure of the will, which finds a powerful later echo in Seamus Heaney's prose on the force of the imagination pushing back against the force of reality, Yeats himself is most useful as a way into his own poems. Across 3,000 miles of water, he is that majestic shade John Berryman moved to Dublin in 1966 to have it out with after years of neglect, because, as the Dream song has it, ingratitude is the necessary curse of making things new. He is, in Michael Hartnett's famous farewell, Chef Yeats, that master of the use of herbs, who could raise mere stew to a glorious height, pinch of saga, sousson of philosophy, carefully stirred in to get the flavour right, and cook a poem around the basic verbs. He is in the kitchen too with Eamon Brennan, who is making in either Connemara or New York the cold, companionable manners of the wild swans that cool his own, as long as that music lasts, while all the while the cottage fills to steamy brimming with smells that distill into the air some vegetarian notion of the soul, and fills with the ceremony of sound he stirred into the stock of his own marrow-bone soup to keep us, even in lean times, warm. Between incantation and sense, in Yeats's sublimely beautiful lines, we are participants in the act of the poem and are made privy to the state of stopped time to which Yeats, in the act of writing, gains utter access to the power of word singing singly and in concert. And because the prerequisites of soul, song, and formal necessity are perfectly in place, we find ourselves moved to tenderness again and again in the shared thought of the poem. Yeats shows us how it is possible for the verb to be used in conjunction with the indefinite article and the noun poet. What we experience in him, in the great poems that appropriate and express the world, is a movement in our very selves to tenderness and ambition for the higher gifts of language. The poems are as real and palpable as hares and trees and dead airmen, and it falls to each of our generations in our negotiations with him to know that whatever we may learn, as Ivan Boland's beautiful sonnet has it, Yeats is its sum. The poem I wanted to read is a prayer for my daughter. It's described by Derek Graham as a great pram poem, one of the great pram poems, which is a lovely understatement. A prayer for my daughter. Once more the storm is howling and half hid. Under this cradle hood and cover lid, my child sleeps on. There is no obstacle but Gregory's wood and one bare hill, whereby the haystack and roof levelling wind, bred on the Atlantic, can be stayed. And for an hour I have walked and prayed, because of the great gloom that is in my mind. I have walked and prayed for this young child an hour, and heard the sea wind scream upon the tower, and under the arches of the bridge, and scream in the elms above the flooded stream, imagining in excited reverie that the future years had come, dancing to a frenzied drum, out of the murderous innocence of the sea. May she be granted beauty, and yet not beauty to make a stranger's eye distraught, or hers before a looking glass, for such, being made beautiful overmuch, consider beauty a sufficient end, lose natural kindness, and maybe the heart-revealing intimacy that chooses right and never find a friend. Helen, being chosen, found life flat and dull, and later had much trouble from a fool, while that great queen that rose out of the spray, being fatherless, could have her way, yet chose a bandy-legged smith for man. It's certain that fine women eat a crazy salad with their meat, whereby the horn of plenty is undone. In courtesy, I'd have her chiefly learned, hearts are not had as a gift, but hearts are earned by those that are not entirely beautiful. Yet many that have played the fool for beauty's very self has charm made wise, and many a poor man that has roved, loved, and thought himself beloved from a glad kindness cannot take his eyes. May she become a flourishing hidden tree, that all her thoughts may like the linnet be, and have no business but dispensing round their magnanimities of sound, nor but in merriment begin a chase, nor but in merriment a quarrel. O may she live like some green laurel, rooted in one dear perpetual place. My mind, because the minds that I have loved, the sort of beauty that I have approved, prosper but little, has dried up of late, yet knows that to be choked with hate may well be of all evil chances chief. If there is no hatred in a mind, assault and battery of the wind can never tear the linnet from the leaf. An intellectual hatred is the worst, so let her think opinions are accursed. Have I not seen the loveliest woman born out of the mouth of plenty's horn, because of her opinionated mind, bartered that horn and every good by quiet natures understood for an old bellows full of angry wind? Considering that, all hatred driven hence, the soul recovers radical innocence, and learns at last that it is self-delighting, self-appeasing, self-affrighting, and that its own sweet will is heaven's will. She can, though every face should scowl, and every windy quarter howl, or every bellows burst, be happy still, and may her bridegroom bring her to a house where all's accustomed, ceremonious, For arrogance and hatred are the wares, peddled in the thoroughfares. How, but in custom and in ceremony, are innocence and beauty born. Ceremonies, a name for the rich horn, and custom for the spreading olive tree. Thank you.
Our final speaker tonight will be Mark Dyar.
Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to be here. My reflection on the poetry of W.B. Yeats, I have titled Master of the Still Stars and of the Burning Door, which is the last line from the Valley of the Black Pig. I have chosen to read Cuchulainn Comforted, which is a poem that Yeats wrote just a few weeks before his death in 1939. I don't think that I have a favourite Yeats poem, and it might be an impossible task for me to choose. The uncanny excellence, the depth, the fierceness, the very music of additional poems crowd around the name of any contender for the favourite once it is proposed. But for the purposes of our celebration this evening, I'm going to suggest Cuchulainn Comforted as the zenith of Yeats's achievement, and I'm going to read it as if it were not overly adventurous of me to say that it stands as the ultimate realization of what Yeats was trying to do throughout his writing life. Yeats was obsessed with the idea of other worlds within our own, and the possibility of gaining access to them. But his drive towards a writing that was communicative as well as spiritually intense led him to ground himself in personality, in speech, in forms of recognizable experience. Occult philosophy is half of the writer's mind in W.B. Yeats's case, and yet he did strive to write about lived life. However, in a poem like Cuchulainn Comforted, the job of tempering his drive towards the spirit world is in a sense set aside. In this respect, and in the light of the fact that it is one of his last poems, it's tempting to think of Cuchulainn Comforted as a moment where Yeats sings to us from the miraculous depths of his imagination like never before. Before I read the poem for you, I want to identify some moments in other poems, other favourites perhaps, where Yeats can be seen to be building towards the strange purity of Cuchulainn Comforted. I might have chosen to read To Ireland in the Coming Times, which was written when Yeats was in his 20s. I go back to that poem again and again for the measured excess of the way Yeats represents his own imagination as a sphere that is populated by supportive spirits, by elemental creatures, as he calls them. I also return to it for the way that it reflects Yeats's scarcely accountable precociousness and his great conviction in relation to his gift, and for the ways that it offers a kind of window on the poet's early sense of the tension between his drive towards mystical transcendence through poetry on the one hand, and on the other, his concern for historical and national engagement, and the related question of his being regarded as an Irish writer in some kind of inviolable sense. Yeats would be counted, he tells us, true brother of a company that sang to sweeten Ireland's wrong. He wrote these words in part in an argumentative and paranoid mode, feeling himself at risk of being discounted from that company. To read To Ireland in the Coming Times now is to encounter an eerily prophetic sense of Yeats's literary afterlife. When at the close of the poem he addresses you, in the dim coming times, he is speaking to us, his unending audience, for whom, of course, the image of Yeats is a matter of continuous discussion and distortion, as well as a matter of celebration. Yeats, at 25 years of age, it seems, had thought of this. We might even say he had tonight in mind, before the University of Liverpool ever got the commemorative ball rolling at committee level. I'm not going to read to Ireland in the coming times, but I wanted to say that the figure of Yeats as a phenomenon of artistic certainty, a writer possessed of what Seamus Heaney termed a samurai stare, is a version of the poet that I return to and take great pleasure from. I might also have chosen to read The Collarbone of a Hare, another poem where Yeats represents his poethood in terms of perceptual intensity. It contains that much admired metaphor for poetic process drawn from folk tradition, where Yeats depicts himself discovering the skeleton of a hare, selecting the collarbone, and then drilling into it a delicate hole in order to create a viewing device, part monocle and part telescope, through which the world is seen, to borrow words from the American poet Wallace Stevens, more truly and more strange. The collarbone in question is suitable for the work of the vision, the poem tells us, because it has been worn thin by the lapping of water. Water that contributes to the attainment of a radically subtle truth by virtue of being calm. In the end, the visionary vista, seen through the hole in the collarbone, amounts to a knowledge that is expressed in the form of laughter. Laughter directed at all who marry in churches. In the terms of The Collarbone of a Hare, to marry in a church is an image of conformity. It is to risk a kind of perceptual sleep, a complacency, and thereby to run the risk of missing the visionary dimensions of human existence. I might have chosen to read The Collarbone of a Hare this evening, and I would have enjoyed emphasizing this Yeatsian provocation as an example of his trademark balancing of philosophical extremes with loaded narrative grace and accessibility. The great American poet Robert Frost once left Yeats more than a little peeved when he told him that he could tell that the poem The Song of Wandering Aengus had been written with a single stroke of the pen. At that time, Frost, an expat who followed the poet Ezra Pound to London, was wary of Yeats. He privately acknowledged him, somewhat grudgingly, as the big man of poetry over here. But he knew only too well that Yeats, the senior poet, could help him enormously and easily if he chose to. A letter survived which reveals that Frost and his wife Eleanor were both irate when they heard that Yeats had said in private that Frost's first collection of poems was the best of recent American poetry. Irate because he had not been motivated to express this opinion in a well-circulated review. Here are the concluding lines of The Song of Wandering Aengus. Though I am old with wandering through hollow lands and hilly lands, I will find out where she is gone, and kiss her lips, and take her hands, and walk among long dappled grass, and pluck till time and times are done the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun. However long it took to write, this poem is likely to be read for all time, and its lasting power belongs in part to its accessibility, its storybook quality, its being more concretely visual than visionary. Until we get to the supra-fertile glintingness of those closing images, that fine fusing of the cosmological with the agricultural, which serves to create a timeless reading and listening pleasure. The silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun. But in the third to last line there's that strange syntactical weave of the words time and times. Aengus vows to pluck or harvest the fruits of sun and moon until some kind of partial eternity is complete. We are not particularly challenged here, but those words, till time and times, are done, with their curious parsing of duration, deviate from the poem's core clarity, its surface commitment to mere storytelling. I like to forage for the logic here. If time and times were to end, which would go first? Might there be a gradual undoing of these two states? Could experience, even just Aengus's experience, inhere separately in times when time itself is done? Or must they both go in the same wink of apocalypse? Such ambiguity is central to Yeats's overarching drive towards transcendence, which cannot be achieved without a kind of preposterous mastery of sense experience and a seeming dominion over the nature of time and space. In short, a kind of rehearsed divinity. And that is one of the things we get at the end of the Song of Wandering Aengus. The point I wanted to make here is that that reference to time and times is an example of Yeats bridling for expansiveness that is not quite appropriate for the writing. It is, in short, a revealing excess, whose significance is illuminated by a poem like the wonderful Cuchulainn Comforted, which does not care for ordinary reality at all, and does not attempt to check the author's drive towards magic, his wish to get behind the veil of reality, to journey even in the darkness of death, and to send back his poems, almost like flares, announcing that the time we have together in this world is, in the end, more mysterious than we could have ever imagined. Cuchulainn Comforted seems to say that the journey will be strange, but that something does await us. To follow W.B. Yeats, one of the greatest writers of all time, into the stranger dimensions of his poetic singing, is to encounter the fact that when we are willing to go there, he is always more than willing to meet us halfway. Cuchulainn Comforted. A man that had 6 mortal wounds, a man violent and famous, strode among the dead. Eyes stared out of the branches and were gone. Then certain shrouds that muttered head to head came and were gone. He leant upon a tree, as though to meditate on wounds and blood. A shroud that seemed to have authority among those bird-like things came and let fall a bundle of linen. Shrouds by 2 and 3 came creeping up because the man was still. And thereupon that linen carrier said, "Your life can grow much sweeter if you will obey our ancient rule and make a shroud. Mainly because of what we only know, the rattle of those arms makes us afraid. We thread the needle's eyes, and all we do, all must do together." That done, the man took up the nearest and began to sew. "Now we shall sing, and sing the best we can, but first you must be told our character." convicted cowards all, by kindred slain, or driven from home and left to die in fear. They sang, but had nor human notes nor words, though all was done in common as before. They had changed their throats and had the throats of birds.
Thanks very much to our four speakers, and there was no, we didn't discuss with each other what poems would be chosen, but I think that there was a great variety there, from Yeats, a kind of national poet in Easter 1916, right to the other extreme of Cuchulainn Comforted, a deeply strange, kind of mysterious, magical poem. And that's one of the great things about Yeats, is just he has this enormous range, and he wrote great poems from when he was a very young man right until the week of his death. He was still writing great poetry. I'm going to take some questions from the floor in a moment. When I think about Yeats, I was thinking about that line that from the poem that Tom read, where Yeats makes certain wishes for his beloved daughter. And one of the things he wishes for is, let her think opinions are a curse. So I'm going to try not to have any opinions. And when I teach Yeats, and I see many of my students here and former students try to teach Yeats, I'm conscious of that Yeats is so mercurial and mystical that having a set opinion about him is almost impossible, I think. So that's my dodge out of having one. And I'm going to take questions from the floor. Now.
Yeah, we talked a lot about Yeats and the personal experience, and how we touched on how handy his lines are for novels, for titles of novels, for say. But I hope this is a whole panel. Can I talk a little bit about Yeats' influence on international literature rather than just, I suppose, specifically the Irish, for Irish people, his kind of standing as an international poet?
What comes to mind for me, I guess, since I mentioned Robert Frost in that historical moment of Leisure Hand, who was much closer to Yeats than Frost was at that time, was his secretary in manner of speaking, and what Yeats represented to American poetry, the kind of excitement that he generated, the kind of validation he offered American poetry, which was really just getting on its feet. Really only one major achievement at that time being Walt Whitman, something that felt like American poetry to American writers and maybe to American people. But Yeats had as Pan said, become an expert in Renaissances. He had somehow transcended the Irish colonial experience and the constriction, and had entered the void and generated something. And that was enormously important for American poetry. And even some of the greatest American poets writing up into the 1950s, something like Wallace Stevens, who was a poet maybe as good as Yeats, maybe as good, a different kind of gift, but certainly somebody that could encompass Yeats. Is still wrestling with him. It's wrestling actually in a lifelong way with the late Isle of Wilshire, and can't escape it, thinking about cabins, thinking about the deep heart's core. And so Yeats really did cast a spell. I think another aspect, Wallace Stevens wrote 3 plays before he gave up on the idea of being a writer with any commercial foothold at all, and became a lawyer. And those 3 plays were absolutely sanctioned by Yeats's theatrical experiments. And so it goes right across. And you do something like Robinson Jeffers, who builds a Tor Valley League in California in the 60s. The spell, that's something to do with the distance of Ireland, something to do with the idea of Ireland as Yeats' influence. It's enormous in American poetry, and it's ongoing as well. I suppose, speaking as an Irish poet, I can look to Wallace Stevens and get excited and talk about him, but I'm a little bit uncertain about W.B. Yeats. I wouldn't like to be infected in any way at all, as much as I'm addicted. Absolutely. But there's just, what could be the outcome? Could I invoke Yeats in a poem that generate poetry? Could I hope to move a reader when they recognise a bit of intersectionality? Very unlikely. And Yeats's work is so extraordinary that
is he an obstacle?
Well, no, he's only an example in the sense. He's only a master in the sense that he inspires you to go absolutely the opposite direction and do your own thing, be your own writer. Because that's what he did. That's the example. The range, of course, is there. That's edifying in human terms, not in terms of being a writer to steal or depart from or to embrace. It's terrifying. It still is. It was certainly for Irish poets. Going back to the 50s and 60s, and the assimilation of Yeats is dark side.
Could I say, well, apart from the story I told about Mary's sister, Mrs. Pandit, and her obsession with Yeats, and I remember also sharing a platform once at the All India English Teachers Association when I was a young diplomat with the then Indian Education Minister, Karan Singh, with the Maharaj of Kashmir. He could quote Yeats all day. He spoke for about 40 minutes and never refer to any text. He knew Yeats so well. Like I asked Mrs. Pandit, I said, Mrs. Pandit, where did you learn those poems? Because that's the issue, she was in her early 80s. And she said to me, I learned those poems when I was interned during the 1930s with my brother as part of India's struggle for independence. And for us, Yeats was an inspiration. We learned those poems and I'd never forgotten them. And that was, to me, an eye-opener for the young diplomat to discover that our Irish poet had such a global reach. When you think about it, Yeats, he was interested in Indian philosophy, he championed Tagore, he was interested in Japanese no plays. So he had a global, one of his great poems, said Byzantium, an interest in that kind of Greek classical world. Also, a few weeks ago, I launched a book for poems on the underground because they featured Yeats on the underground there in March and April, and along with some other Irish poets. And we had a launch, and a number of poets turned up. We had a poet from the Caribbean, from Jamaica, who flew in especially for the event in order to read a poem she'd written about Yeats called Sligoville, about all the place names in Jamaica that come from County Sligo, and she just came all the way. We had another Chinese poet who came and read one of Yeats' poems. In fact, read Yeats' obituary, Cast the Cold Eye on Life on Death, Horseman Passed By, in Mandarin. Chanted it in Mandarin. It was wonderful. So I think there is something, and this is one of the things I'm very conscious of. I'm representative of a small country with a population of, on the island of Ireland, 6.5 million, in our state, 4.5 million. The biggest risk to a country of our size is to be invisible on the global stage. And we manage to be more visible than we've any right to be as a small country of our size because we have Yeats and Joyce and Wilde and O'Casey and Synge and Beckett and people that attract attention. When I was ambassador in Berlin, whenever we had an open day every year as part of a Berlin thing that you open up the embassy and the general public came in and you stamped their passports for them and they had their passports for the day, they had to visit all the embassies and so on. Anyway, people came in their large numbers. And the thing I noticed that in those occasions was that the piece of visual imagery we had at the embassy that attracted most attention was an old poster of 8 Irish writers: Yeats, Joyce, O'Casey, Kavanagh, Swift, Wilde, and Shaw. And all these Germans who just came into the embassy on a casual basis because they wanted to have a look at what the embassy was like. The thing that really got them going was, I didn't realise that. I didn't realise Ireland had so many great writers. And again, when I was in Germany, I had a Yeats exhibition that the Department of Foreign Affairs put together, a very simple thing. I went to 12 German cities And it was a time when Ireland was, shall we say, not the most popular country in the world because it was in the midst of the financial crisis. And it was great to be able to get into a German university and talk to a German audience about something other than the problems of the Eurozone and the problems of our economy. And yet it was a way in which we could remind people there was a lot more to Ireland than the things that were appearing in the daily papers happening now in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I remember talking about the quotability of Yeats, that at the time of the financial crash in Ireland, Yeats got quoted quite a lot, as did Joyce. I think The Economist ran a story called After the Race, when things went horribly wrong. I'll take another question from the audience. Yes, Jane, I think.
It's just a general question for the panel. Why do you think that Yeats' reputation has grown and developed over the years in comparison with other Irish writers whose reputation has dwindled as the years have gone on? I'm thinking of people say like Yates O'Brien, Austin Clarke, those kind of writers.
I think because he was in a league far apart from them, good as they were. There's, it's the difference between genius and people who were in many ways exceptional. Yeats was touched by genius, and it's in the same way that Joyce was, in the same way that Beckett was. And I think that is something that isn't just recognised as we speak. It's something that, people who get literature, who get great literature, get it everywhere in the world. And that's why Yeats has sustained. Yes, of course, it has to do with the fact that American universities took him on, that he became lionized internationally. But it is fundamentally about the quality of his genius. Simply as simple as that.
That's a very difficult concept, though, isn't it? What is great?
No one can read it. And if you don't when you read Yeats.
I think greatness in Yeats' case is that life on the page isn't the thing, really, even though the thing is so beautifully laid out on the page. He lives in the minds and hearts of, I'd say, most people here, and an awful lot of people in the world. And that's where his life is, not in the books and not on the page. And I think that's why he's great, really. The fact that we carry him around with us all the time, and in times when, even when we're not stuck from or really in a tight corner, but at all sorts of times in our lives, these words just come to us. We find these words coming to us, and they came from him. I suppose that's greatness, really. That kind of facility for the words just come to you. Yes.
In 1916, I read a poem in Citadel in the front lounge there, in front of the pool, and has said widely school days about it, and including a biography of things. And I'm wondering whether a lot of his inspiration came from the fact that he was thwarted in the
Yeah, that's we didn't hear too much about love. Well, we did. Fergal's attempts at wooing 15-year-old girls back in the day. But of course, I mean, the love story between Yeats and Maud Gonne is one of the most famous in literature. And
of course, what would have happened had they gotten it together in the modern parlance is it would have ended in disaster, vicious catastrophe. It was a very idealised kind of love, but of course the best love poetry is. And of course then the other best love poetry is the love poetry after a breakup, and where you get, which you see in Yeats when he finally realises it's not going to happen. And he turns on her in a very public way. I mean, this is extraordinary. This is poetry that's been published while she is alive. In incredibly bitter. And she is, when you read her accounts of meeting and speaking to Yeats towards the end of her life, she is extraordinarily generous and magnanimous. Given how she is, as though she accepted the role of being both worshipped and then demonised, in effect, and is forever linked, not in her own name, of course, Maud Gonne, but as the unrequited love of William Butler Yeats, and perhaps the mother of Sean McBride and wife of John McBride.
Well, she probably she probably liked it as well. I think she probably, I think she got a lot of kudos, a lot of mileage out of being the sort of muse of a great poet. I mean, honestly, can you imagine it? I mean, to find this man writing poems about you from his 20s into his 70s. Okay, they weren't all necessarily wholly approving of her, but nonetheless, there was an obsession with her. I mean, there was an obsession with her, which must have been somewhat flattering, I would have thought, for anyone.
Nowadays, she's probably get a court order.
But she also writes. I remember reading one of her letters, an extraordinary letter, where she says, "You want me to marry you, but I can't marry you. If I marry you, you won't write all those great poems. The world will never forgive me." It was the most elaborate, most ingenious sort of rejection thing. It was probably true, of course. No, I think she's an extraordinary figure, and she was part of his argument with Ireland. I mean, I think he had a genuine passion for all things Irish, which he acquired from John O'Leary early in his life, before he even met Paul Gunn. But I certainly think that she added another dimension to his obsession with Ireland. And when you think about it, the number of great poems he wrote about Ireland is extraordinary. And even though he lived most of his life in this country, there are very few references to English places or British themes in his poems. In fact, he was rather dismissive of the idea of writing poems about the war, for example. He dismissed that idea, and when he did write a war poem, it was a kind of anti-war poem in the form of an Irish airman foresees his death. So I think she was an important element to his life, and I think without her, I don't think he would have written in quite the same powerful way. I think he needed to be tortured by Ireland and by a woman. The combination of being tortured by Ireland and a woman gave him a uniquely powerful insight into the human condition. By the way, I did read 2 Yeats poems at my wedding as well, and I remember when I first met my wife, who's Australian, as some of you know, I started reading Yeats' poems to her on the basis that I thought, well, the romantic Irishman would probably hide my true nature.
As a footnote to that, Seamus Heaney talks about what can be the making of somebody who's trying to write verse is an important wound. And I think he's written fairly extensively on the importance of getting the important wound early on. So you can think of Yeats as being extremely blessed.
That reminds me of a line by Frank O'Connor, Frank O'Connor said that he had the ideal childhood for a writer, and that it was tolerably miserable. I think I'll take one more question, if there is one, before we retire for a drink and a chat with our contributors. Yes.
Yeats is arguably Ireland's greatest poet, and his brother Jack B. Yeats is arguably one of Ireland's greatest artists. Was this a coincidence, and what was their relationship?
Well, I'm actually, as it happens, next week I'm speaking about Yeats at the Newbury Festival on Tuesday next, and then on, I think it's Thursday or Friday, there's an exhibition of Irish art at the Mall Galleries on the Strand in London. On the Mall in London, and it includes some pieces by Jack B. Yeats. And I've been asked to give a talk about about the brothers Yeats, Irish cultural icons. So I'm actually reading up at the moment about Jack B. because I don't know a huge amount about him. I admire his work, but I don't know a huge amount about him. I think they had first of all, politically, in terms of their Irish nationalism, they were on different sides of the argument, because Yeats was essentially a supporter of the pro-treaty side in the 1920s, and disliked the fanaticism, as he saw it, of the Republicans at that time, whereas his brother was a firm supporter of the anti-treaty side at that stage. So they had differences of opinion when it came to their political outlook. I think their relationship seems to have been reasonably good, but they didn't feature hugely in each other's lives. Jack B. Yeats did do illustrations for some of Yeats's early books and so on. So, I mean, they collaborate to some extent. I'm actually also, later in the year, I'm giving a talk at Bedford Park about the Yeats family, and I'm calling it the Yeats of Bedford Park. And I'm going to argue in that they were probably the most talented Irish family ever to live in Britain, in the sense that you had his father, John B. Yeats, who was a fine portrait artist and an extremely good talker. His letters are brilliant. He was a very intelligent and insightful man who had lots of very important friends in the London of the 1890s and early 20th century. You had W.B. Yeats. You had Jack B. Yeats, probably the greatest Irish painter of the 20th century. And then you had his two sisters, Lily and Lolly, who were both worked with William Morris and went back to Ireland and developed the arts and crafts movement there and the Culla Press and so on. Or in other words, gave rise to a whole arts and craft industry in Ireland. So, I think between them, the Yeats family were quite an extraordinary family. Was it a coincidence? I think probably not. I'm sure the upbringing was important. I'm sure the father's influence and the mother's, and the mixture of that kind of clerical sort of academic creative background that the father brought, and the mother's family were clearly solid merchant family who, and the combination seems to have influenced the children in a very positive direction from the point of view of creativity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it sort of comes back to that question, that very difficult question again of greatness and genius. And there are some artists and some writers, and you read them, and you read a poem like, say, Comforted, or Ego Dominus Tuus, and maybe I should admit this as someone who tries to teach Yeats, you just shake your head. It's a bit like watching Lionel Messi, you know. You don't know how he did it. You know. And that's all I would say about Jack, the Yeats family, Jack and Willie Yeats. They were born, and that's that.
Was it nature or nurture?
I said I wouldn't express opinions, and I just did. Apologies for that. I want to thank our speakers again for a wonderful night. It's such a pleasure to hear Yeats read aloud. That's how he would have wanted it. Yeats wanted his poetry to be read aloud and to have that kind of incantatory quality that you heard him use when he was reciting The Lake Isle of Innisfree himself. I was struck very much by a quote that Tom gave from an early Yeats essay, The Symbolism of Poetry, where Yeats says that the purpose of rhyme in poetry is to prolong the moment of contemplation. Prolong the moment of contemplation. And we I think, live in a world where contemplation is increasingly difficult. In the world of smartphones and social media and pace. I don't want to be like Cullen fighting the waves. The waves are coming, and that's that, and you can't defeat them. But I think in poetry, and in Yeats' poetry in particular, you can get into these almost trance-like states where you prolong the moment of contemplation. And for that reason, if for no other, I think Yeats is worth going back to again and again. So please put your hands together and thank our panelists.